It is July 20th, 2026, and something happened in the Persian Gulf overnight that Iranian state media's denials cannot fully walk back. A guided missile destroyer turned into the wind, opened its vertical launch cells, and began firing a large salvo of Tomahawk cruise missiles, one after another, arcing across the night sky toward radar sites, communication hubs, air defense batteries, and reported IRGC leadership infrastructure spread across Iranian territory. Not just the coast, not just the strait, but reaching into the interior. Kharg, southwest of Tehran, Bandar Abbas, Keshem. The map of Iranian military infrastructure lit up in a single night by precision weapons reported to have struck with high accuracy. And then came a statement that has been circulating for months in one form or another, resurfacing again this week with renewed intensity, that the United States might not just keep striking Kharg Island, the terminal handling roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, it might take control of it outright. Read that carefully, because the exact status of that idea matters. Trump has raised the possibility of seizing Kharg repeatedly since the earliest weeks of this conflict, telling reporters at various points that the U.S. just may take over the island, that Iran couldn't do anything about it if it did, and refusing directly to rule the option out when pressed by reporters this month. That is a real, recurring, and escalating threat, backed by actual Marine expeditionary units and Army airborne elements positioned in the region specifically for a scenario like this. It is not, as of anything independently confirmed, a completed action or a formally announced permanent annexation of Iranian territory. The distinction matters enormously for understanding where this conflict actually stands tonight versus where the most dramatic framing of it wants to place it. But let's back all the way up, because to understand how a night of Tomahawk launches and a renewed round of seizure talk fits into the broader shape of this war, you need to understand the sequence that produced it, and why Iran's inability to bring anything resembling an acceptable position to the negotiating table is not simply a diplomatic failure. It is the predictable output of a command structure that has been running the same playbook since the Islamic Republic's founding, and does not appear to know how to run a different one. This current round of intensified strikes follows the collapse of the ceasefire that had held since roughly April. A ceasefire whose safe passage provisions for commercial shipping broke down amid renewed IRGC attacks on tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's military has continued firing on vessels in the weeks since, and Central Command's blockade enforcement, including the Hellfire strike that disabled a tanker attempting to reach Kharg, reflects the reimposition of a naval blockade following that breakdown. Separately, back in early June, a U.S. Army AH-64 Apache helicopter patrolling near the Strait of Hormuz went down after being struck by what U.S. officials attributed to an Iranian drone. Both crew members were rescued from the water by an uncrewed Navy surface vessel in what was reported at the time as the first successful use of a drone boat to recover downed aviators, and Trump vowed a military response, which Central Command carried out in the form of what it called proportional self-defense strikes. That incident is real and well documented. Whether it functions as the specific, immediate trigger for this particular night of strikes, as opposed to one link in a longer chain of escalation stretching back over the preceding weeks, is less clear from available reporting. And it is worth being honest about that rather than compressing a multi-week timeline into a single dramatic opening beat. What is better established is the overall shape of the campaign's recent nights. Strike packages have hit Iranian air defense batteries, ground control stations, and surveillance radar sites ringing the strait and extending into the interior. Central Command has described these operations in the language of proportional response to attacks on U.S. forces and international shipping. Iran, in turn, has claimed strikes on American positions at bases in the region and reported firing toward installations housing U.S. aircraft, claims that have been reported with varying degrees of confirmation and that, consistent with the pattern throughout this war, should be treated as reported rather than settled until independently verified, given the IRGC's institutional incentive to claim success regardless of what actually happened on the ground. Here's the analytical point drawing the most attention this week, and it deserves to be stated with the appropriate caveat attached. Assessments circulating in defense and open-source analysis circles suggest Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles have fallen dramatically from pre-conflict levels, with some estimates putting the reduction at somewhere in the range of 90%. That is a striking figure, and if accurate, it reframes what recent, smaller Iranian missile salvos actually represent. An institution that built its entire deterrent posture and regional leverage around the possession of a large ballistic missile inventory, launching only 10 or so missiles at a time with days between launches, looks less like tactical patience and more like inventory management at the edge of depletion. A force that once could launch salvos in the hundreds now appears to be carefully rationing what remains rather than executing a confident, sustained campaign. That interpretation is plausible and consistent with the broader pattern of this war, but it rests on assessed figures rather than a single confirmed government inventory count. And it should be presented with that caveat, rather than as a hard, sourced number. The platforms involved in a strike package of this scale follow a now familiar architecture. Precision cruise missiles, capable of low-altitude terrain following flight and GPS-updated in-flight retargeting, deliver effects to within meters of designated coordinates, distributed simultaneously across the geographic depth of Iranian territory, rather than concentrated on a single target set. F-16. Wild weasels operate as the suppression layer, hunting Iranian radar emitters with anti-radiation missiles that home on a radar's own electromagnetic signature the moment it activates, meaning any Iranian operator attempting to build a picture of the incoming strike risks becoming a target himself. Behind that suppression layer, F-15E Strike Eagles carry the heavier precision ordnance, including bunker-penetrating munitions designed to reach hardened or partially buried targets, arriving once the air defense environment has been degraded enough for them to operate. F-35s track the Iranian response in real time, feeding intelligence into the targeting cycle for whatever comes next, while carrier-based F-18 Super Hornets and airborne early warning aircraft coordinate the overall picture across the operational area. This is a layered multi-platform architecture operating at a scale that reflects the sustained investment the U.S. has made in precision strike capability over the preceding 2 decades, executing against an Iranian air defense network that has been degraded across successive nights of this campaign. On the Kharg Island question specifically, it is worth separating the rhetoric from the operational reality as carefully as possible. Every prior strike on the island, going back to a large raid in March that hit more than 90 separate military sites while deliberately sparing the oil and gas terminal itself, has been framed by Washington as maritime security enforcement, degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping while explicitly avoiding damage to the actual export infrastructure. Trump has repeatedly instructed forces to hit everything but the oil, a restraint driven by the recognition that destroying the terminal outright would be an act of self-inflicted global economic harm, given that Kharg handles a share of Chinese seaborne oil imports large enough to move global crude prices meaningfully on rhetoric alone, let alone actual destruction. Talk of an outright seizure, using Marine expeditionary units already positioned in the region alongside Army airborne elements, has surfaced and receded multiple times throughout this conflict, most notably fading after the June Memorandum of Understanding and resurfacing again as that agreement broke down. Retired military officials who have discussed the option publicly, including a former deputy commander of Central Command, have generally agreed that the initial seizure itself would be operationally straightforward given the island's size and limited garrison, while warning that holding it afterward against Iranian shore-based missiles, drones, and prepared defensive positions is the genuinely dangerous part of any such operation, a warning echoed by a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander who has publicly said he would be very worried about an operation like this, given what he described as Iran's clever and ruthless approach to asymmetric resistance. If a seizure of Kharg does eventually move from threat to action, the strategic logic behind it is not difficult to follow. The terminal represents the mechanism through which a very large share of Iran's oil export revenue flows, funding, among other things, the IRGC's institutional operations, its regional proxy network, and its weapons procurement. Removing that revenue stream from Tehran's control would strike at the financial infrastructure sustaining the conflict rather than simply destroying the current inventory of weapons available to fight it, a strategically different kind of pressure than the strikes conducted so far. Comparisons to the mechanisms the U.S. has used to constrain Venezuelan oil revenue have circulated in commentary around this idea, though it is worth being clear that any such arrangement for Iran remains speculative rather than an announced, implemented policy as of the most recent confirmed reporting. Now, to the underlying strategic problem that explains why negotiations have repeatedly stalled despite periods of apparent diplomatic progress, including the Memorandum of Understanding signed in June that briefly reduced tensions before breaking down. The Strait of Hormuz functions for the IRGC primarily as leverage, a mechanism for generating bargaining power against the United States with enough economic stake in Gulf energy security to be pulled toward the negotiating table under the right pressure. The deeper strategic objective long attributed to the IRGC by analysts tracking this conflict is institutional survival through eventual nuclear weapons capability, using the strait as leverage to force reduced American regional presence, using whatever diplomatic space that creates to advance the nuclear program, and ultimately governing from behind the protection of a nuclear deterrent that makes direct military action against the regime prohibitively costly for any outside actor. That is why the demands attributed to Iranian negotiators in various rounds of this conflict, full reparations, a complete American withdrawal from the region, and an unrestricted right to develop nuclear capability, function less as opening bids in a normal negotiation and more as a maximalist floor incompatible with any position the American side, or its regional partners, or the broader non-proliferation framework, could realistically accept. Iran's diplomatic representatives, its foreign ministry, and its president are the outward-facing part of a system in which actual decision-making authority is widely understood to rest with the IRGC rather than with the elected or appointed civilian officials who show up to talks in Doha or elsewhere. Those officials cannot conclude an agreement without IRGC buy-in, and the IRGC's institutional interest in preserving its nuclear program, its regional proxy network, and its dominant internal position has made every round of negotiation in this conflict genuinely difficult to close, not necessarily because anyone involved is negotiating in bad faith, but because the structural gap between what the IRGC's institutional survival requires and what Washington has said it will accept, publicly and repeatedly, that Iran will not be permitted a nuclear weapon, may simply not be bridgeable through language alone. That structural incompatibility is the backdrop against which the renewed talk of Kharg's seizure and the broader push toward Iran's underground and interior infrastructure should be read. If a negotiated outcome that satisfies both the IRGC's institutional requirements and America's stated red lines is not achievable, then the alternative available to Washington is reducing the underlying capacity of the Iranian side to sustain the conflict, rather than simply destroying its current weapons inventory faster than that inventory can be replaced. During the periods when a ceasefire is held, Iran has reportedly used the pause to disperse and bury what remained of its most valuable military assets, moving mobile launchers and missile stockpiles into hardened underground positions in areas the earlier coastal-focused phase of strikes had not reached. That shift changes the targeting problem in a real technical way, since striking a surface radar site requires a single precision munition with appropriate guidance, while striking a hardened underground facility requires heavier, purpose-built penetrating weapons and considerably more detailed intelligence about exactly where the target sits and how it's configured. Persistent overhead surveillance, thermal and electromagnetic signature analysis, and human intelligence gathered throughout the conflict all feed into that targeting picture, and reports throughout this campaign have described previously unknown underground sites being identified and struck not long after their construction, suggesting the American side has invested heavily in tracking exactly where Iran has been relocating its most protected assets. The honest strategic assessment tonight is that Iran is fighting a war it has been unable to resolve through negotiation, is absorbing sustained pressure across military, economic, and diplomatic tracks simultaneously, and is doing so with a ballistic missile inventory that credible assessments suggest has been substantially reduced from pre-conflict levels, though the precise figure remains an estimate rather than a hard, confirmed number. Its coastal military infrastructure has been struck repeatedly across months of operations. Its underground reconstitution efforts appear to be running into an American intelligence and surveillance capability specifically built to track exactly that kind of dispersal. Its access to the revenue generated by Kharg Island remains, for now, intact but under recurring and escalating threat, one that has moved from rhetoric to active planning and back again multiple times over the course of this conflict, without yet resulting in a confirmed seizure. And its only long-term strategic option for outlasting this pressure, preserving enough of the regime's institutional capacity to eventually complete a nuclear weapons program, is directly and repeatedly opposed by the stated position of the American government. None of that guarantees where this goes next. A campaign built around degrading Iran's coordination and revenue infrastructure could produce exactly the outcome Washington is aiming for, a regime unable to sustain the fight long enough to outlast the pressure. It could also, as officials and analysts have separately cautioned, produce something considerably less predictable, a more fragmented adversary in which decisions, once made deliberately at the top, increasingly reflect the judgment of whoever holds launch authority in a given province on a given night, rather than fewer decisions being made at all. There's also a regional and international dimension worth folding into this picture, because a war of this duration does not stay contained to the two primary combatants. Every additional week this conflict runs without resolution adds pressure to Gulf partner states whose own economies depend on stable transit through the strait, and adds pressure to global energy markets that have already reacted sharply to rhetoric alone, let alone renewed strikes or an actual attempt on Kharg. European governments, which rely on Gulf-linked benchmark pricing for a meaningful share of their own energy costs, have a growing stake in how this resolves, even from a position of relative distance from the fighting itself. That broadening set of interested parties does not necessarily accelerate a resolution, but it does mean the pool of actors with a genuine interest in how this war ends keeps expanding, which is itself a form of pressure on Tehran that operates independently of anything happening on the battlefield. It is also worth being honest about how much of the most dramatic framing circulating around this war right now outruns what has actually been confirmed by official sources on either side. Threats to seize Kharg Island have been floated, walked back, and floated again multiple times since this conflict began. And the gap between the U.S. is actively planning for this, and the U.S. has done this, matters enormously for anyone trying to understand where things actually stand tonight, rather than where the loudest version of the story wants to place them. The same caution applies to specific operational figures circulating about missile counts, stockpile percentages, and precise strike sequencing. Some of those figures may hold up under later scrutiny, others may not. Treating an assessed estimate with the same certainty as an official, sourced confirmation is exactly the kind of collapsing of categories that makes it harder, not easier, to understand a war this complicated while it is still unfolding. What is confirmed tonight is a war that has continued to escalate across multiple simultaneous pressure tracks, a renewed and unresolved threat hanging over Iran's single most important piece of economic infrastructure, and a regime whose diplomatic signals continue to contradict its military actions in ways that suggest an institution struggling to speak with one voice, let alone negotiate with one.